Not many people go from finishing their PhD to CEO of a publicly traded biotech company in the span of 8 years. But my guest today has done just that. From a background in cardiology, he is now the CEO of Spyre Therapeutics, which is developing precision medicines for inflammatory diseases. This is the Discovery Arc podcast. I am Drew Douglin, and join me in welcoming Cameron Turtle.
Cameron, take me back. Where did it all begin? How did you get involved in science? Where did the passion come from? What was your kind of background, early life? How did it all start?
Yeah, well, appreciate you having me on. It's good to see you again. My background in early childhood is I grew up in a pretty small college town, actually, in Eastern Washington, and a pretty unusual place where it's about 10,000 permanent residents and about 15,000 students. So a really small town, more students than full-time people. And the demographics were pretty unique, where you functionally had half the town of full-time people were associated with the university, so professors and their families, and then the other half were mostly farmers and their families. And my kind of growing up in my summer jobs were kind of equally split between those two areas. So and sometimes in the same summer, sometimes in the same day, I was working literally on a wheat farm, like carrying a backpack full of weed killer and spraying thistles and walking around in the heat in jeans and long sleeves, because you can't not be. And then working in engineering labs separately, or sometimes on the same day. So I worked in an environmental engineering lab for a summer and a chemical engineering lab for a summer. And I think really setting the bar of comparing against hiking through the wheat fields with a weed killer, like science feels pretty good relatively. Like air conditioned labs, you're getting to work on interesting problems. And I could see even early days, there's something that's pretty addictive about seeing something for the first time and seeing something that's new and novel and could lead to something important for kind of society writ large when you're doing that. And I saw that as a high school student doing summer lab projects. And that's kind of the thread that has kind of always kept me excited about it, is kind of making something, leaving something behind that's new and important and different. And so that's really where it started, and I've kind of adjusted various versions of it from then. But comparing those lab work to a wheat field is a pretty easy decision in terms of what was a better fit and a better, more comfortable life.
Yeah, that farming life is not easy.
that's I'm not cut out for it. Yeah, exactly.
So do you want to be an engineer then, as you kind of got into school?
Yeah, so my undergraduate was an engineering degree. So I did a bioengineering degree as an undergrad. I think I've always actually been more of an engineer than a scientist. I love learning new things and seeing new things, but what really gets me up in the morning is making something, and not knowledge for knowledge's sake. It is useful, or is something that is fine to aspire to, but I've always been more interested in creating something that can have an impact. And so I did bioengineering. I actually thought I wanted to go be a clinician, thought I was going to go do an MD afterwards and go into clinical practice. But then somewhere during that engineering degree and then a set of different extracurriculars. So I did research as an undergraduate, actually looking at muscle research. So looking at different types of muscle dysfunction and ways that we can measure muscle activity, and then did some engineering projects for lower resource settings as well as an undergraduate. And somewhere between those two activities, it was clear to me that I actually didn't really want to practice on a day-to-day basis. That was not something that was as exciting to me as, again, kind of making something. And whether that was on a biology basis or kind of a computer science engineering basis, those were kind of the two aspects of a bioengineering undergraduate at the time. And I liked both of it. And so I really, that's actually what shifted me towards going to do a PhD instead of going to do an MD, was thinking, okay, that's what I actually want to be invested in versus the day-to-day practice on the MD side. Now, making drugs, I see that there's a lot of MDs that do really great work in terms of helping to make drugs as well, and devices too. So I might have ended up in the same place had I gone to do an MD instead of a PhD. But yeah, made that choice and enjoyed going to do the PhD instead.
Yeah, no regrets.
No regrets. No, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I was lucky enough, as you know, we worked in the same lab in Oxford, and that's a pretty magical place to go do a PhD as well. And yeah, so I certainly wouldn't trade that to go have done a medical degree instead.
What made you feel like you wanted to travel abroad then? Once you came to the realization that, okay, I want to do a PhD, what makes you think, okay, I want to come do it in England?
Yeah, well, so I was actually applying to a whole host of US PhD programs as well. So I was finishing the undergrad, I was applying to US PhD programs, kind of going through those interview processes. But then I ended up getting the Rhodes Scholarship to go to Oxford, and that's not one that you say no to usually. So that really my decision was kind of made for me at that point that I was going to go do the PhD in Oxford. Actually, I remember when getting the scholarship out, I was at that evening asked, well, what college are you going to go to in Oxford? And in the US, college and university are synonyms. That's not the case in Oxford, where the university is made up of component colleges. And so I did not know that actually when I got the Rhodes Scholarship, and had to then go Google around and figure out which college I actually wanted to apply to thereafter. So that was really the driver, though, to go do it in the UK instead of staying in the US for the PhD.
Got it. Yeah, people always ask me what the campus is like in Oxford. I'm just like,
Yeah.
I don't know what to tell you guys. It's a whole collection of campuses.
Depends if you're at if you're at Balliol or St. Cat's, it's different. Yeah, they're not the same.
Yeah. Actually, what college were you at?
I was at St. John's, which funnily enough, yeah, was a great experience. City center, got to live kind of just off the college itself. My wife actually came with me from undergrad to Oxford, so we got to live in just city center couples accommodation the whole time. And yeah, it was really a great experience to go over and do it there.
Was she at university at the same time?
Yeah, so we alternated. So we were actually both applying to graduate schools in the US, looking for co-location, and then the Rhodes adjusted the plans, and so she worked while we were in Oxford, and then when we came back to the US, she did her graduate degree when I started working here.
Wow, very smart way of doing that.
You know, it meant that we had at least one income the whole time, which is a major improvement relative to graduate student stipends.
Yeah. Oh, St. John's is such a beautiful college. And for anyone listening, I was at the much smaller, much poorer college right across the road from St. John's that no one's ever heard of.
That's just that. Yeah, well, I think I knew that I had gotten to a different location when they took us down to the wine cellar at John's, which I think has some tens of thousands of bottles of wine. And yeah, got to see that that's how the other.
Yeah. So you had a background there in bioengineering and muscle. It seemed like, wow, maybe, kinetics, exercise would have been a likely track as well. Why cardiovascular medicine in the end?
Yes. So yeah, I mean, look, I'm a sucker for the heart, because it is kind of an engineer's organ, in terms of it's basically a mix of plumbing in the form of the vasculature, and electrical engineering in the conductivity, and then the muscle itself, which is, as everyone, producing force, regulating the stiffness of the muscle itself. So I've always been kind of thought the heart is an extremely interesting organ. And then, having done muscle research kind of as an undergraduate, it was a pretty straightforward connection, and I think also helped me be pretty efficient in the PhD work as well, because some of the same experiments that you use to look at skeletal muscle function are directly applicable to looking at cardiac muscle function. And that really was the focus of my PhD, was kind of examining cardiac muscle in various different animal models when you had types of dysfunction with it, whether that was inherited mutations that cause dysfunction in the cardiac muscle, or diabetic cardiomyopathy, and other ways that you get insults to the cardiac muscle, and then examining what those insults cause on a molecular level, with, again, from my interest, how do we actually modify that to potentially adjust those diseases? But for my PhD, it was mostly the basic science, explaining the mechanisms, not really trying to fix them per se.
Got it. And it always seemed to me, at least as an outsider, that you took your PhD in your stride. Is that an illusion? Is that a fair estimation?
I mean, I find Oxford was a pretty distracting place to do a PhD, in I think all the best ways possible, which is that I thought that I could do the experiments that I was interested in, and learn kind of the thesis topics and really got to work right away in terms of gathering the data to put it into the publications that came out of my work, and then the PhD thesis as well. But at the same time, getting to do all sorts of other things at Oxford as well, which was really an extraordinary place. So getting to see lectures on topics very far afield from cardiovascular medicine and bioengineering, getting to do clubs and debates and things that kind of get to stimulate your intellectual curiosity far beyond what you're doing for your PhD. And I think a lot more black tie and ball gown events in Oxford as well than I think most people get to do in their graduate school. So it's yeah, I mean, I had a great experience. I think I knew probably even going into the PhD that I was unlikely to stay in academia beyond it. I think, again, coming from an engineering mindset, that I wasn't expecting that I wanted to go kind of take a tenure track position and pursue that path. I really was interested in getting into industry after finishing the PhD. I didn't know exactly how, though. And so I kind of, outside of my research, spent some time doing, for example, I joined a group of MBA students and did a venture capital competition at the university, and did some consulting work for nonprofits, and did some of the kind of the larger consulting firms will do training sessions for scientists as well to kind of let them see what those jobs look like. And so I was really trying to explore kind of how I wanted to get into industry, leaving the PhD, and exploring the different paths and seeing what I thought could be the best fit for me.
So that's the kind of thing you recommend as well, then, really sort of expanding your horizons, trying out some of these different programs, internships, things like that as you're going through your PhD experience?
Well, I think it's, I guess I've always tried to think of what my objective function is for most of the periods of my life, in terms of what do you think the next step will be, and what skill sets, experiences, and credibility do you need to be successful in that next period of your life, and then kind of decide what you therefore should be doing during that period. And so I think for folks that are dead set that they're going to be a tenure track academic, and that's the path that they want to be successful in life, and that's what they're pursuing, then I think I could see the choice of time management during a PhD to be just spend all of your time in the lab working on publications and building up your publication record, as that's largely the currency of getting that subsequent position and the grants that you need to be successful there. And so I think I think any good kind of decision-making process usually starts with what you're trying to solve for. And I think it really, that would be my general guidance, is like understand what you're looking for and try to be self-aware enough to understand what you're good at versus not good at. I knew that I was an adequate scientist, but I didn't get any Nature, Cell, or Science papers out of my PhD. And I thought that was probably not going to be something that would let me get the top tier tenure track faculty positions immediately out of the PhD either. And so I think that was just a bit of, whether it's just self-awareness or just understanding what you're good at or not, I think is pretty critical. And then understanding what you're shooting for as well.
Yeah, I felt like that during my postdoc. I was thinking, well, I'm an okay scientist. I'm not particularly thrilled by staying in academia, and there are so few academic positions. And obviously,
yeah, that's right. It's not just what you're good at, it's what you're relatively good at. And then how does that stack up in terms of what does life look like if you're a 90th percentile scientist? What does that look like for your life versus it might be an 80th percentile somewhere else, and that could be just as good a choice depending on what that path looks like.
So you're finishing up your PhD. What's going through your head then? Where are you thinking you want to go? Where are you thinking you want to do? What's the next step?
Yeah, so a couple of things that had influenced me heavily at the time were there's actually a biotech company getting launched at that time working on the inherited cardiomyopathies, a company called Myocardia getting put together in the Bay Area just as I was finishing up. I thought it was extraordinarily interesting. I was actually chatting with a variety of folks about, hey, could I go directly into industry? Could I go join an early stage biotech company? Talk to a few folks about, hey, maybe I would rather look at investing in early stage biotech companies as well as an alternative path. The choice that I ultimately made was, instead of going to consult for not the smallest of biotech companies, but go do consulting for some of the larger biopharma companies and understand a bit better what the industry looks like, what kind of the larger, more established companies look for and consider good, and also build a skill set that would then be applicable in those other companies as well. Again, I didn't think my path within biotech was going to be scientist one, bench scientist to chief scientific officer. Again, it's not my skill set. I did not think that I was going to be the best at that. And I thought it was something that would probably be not the path for me. And I thought, using some of my interest in kind of the business and financial aspects of biotech was probably the direction for me. I grew up with a finance professor as a father, so that I kind of grew up with discounted cash flows as a bedtime story to put me to sleep most nights. And so I was always kind of interested in the business of biotech as well, and even the biotech markets. Was interested in some biotech stocks during the PhD as well. And so I thought that's probably the direction that I would head. And so somewhere between kind of the business and finance aspects of biotech that I was pursuing, and ultimately chose that consulting path because mostly for the training and expertise that I expected that it would deliver, and what kind of those groups kind of pitch as one of the main reasons to go there, coming out of schooling. And I think that's frankly exactly what I got from it in terms of a set of tools. I mean, the first couple of months you barely do any work. There's a mini MBA where they teach you about accounting and finance principles and marketing and a variety of activities. You spend a few weeks kind of getting taught by people who are really good at things like Excel and PowerPoint. And I know that sounds silly to say, but you actually do get pretty efficient at modeling financially and presenting things in an attractive manner using the tools that you'll then use for the rest of your career. So I actually thought that promise was largely correct, that you kind of do get that quick. You get up to speed pretty quickly on those activities in the consulting world.
Yeah, and once you go through that initial period that you were just talking about, what is the consulting process look like? What are you doing? Is it related to the skill sets and your background that you already had?
Yeah, so I worked exclusively with biopharma companies and medical device companies. So at least in the path that I was able to take, I never was asked to, nor did I ask to do a project for companies that were outside my area of interest. So I worked exclusively with people that were doing things that I thought were relevant to me. A wide range of projects. Some of them I thought were extraordinarily interesting and useful to the client, things where the clients knew an area very well, but had an opportunity to them that was outside that area of expertise. And so they had no one in-house that was able to really evaluate that option. And I saw kind of bringing in an external consulting group, kind of beat up that idea from all different angles and bring in all sorts of experts from various areas to evaluate the options. Exceedingly good use of money, and in retrospect can see that some of those companies made major pivots to their overall strategy, that some of them were very successful as a result. Other times the projects were maybe not as interesting or as useful to the clients, and those ones are more challenging because regardless of what you're working on, you are working an absurd amount of time and hours, and you're traveling a lot, and you're working predominantly with, I'd say, very type A individuals as well, where you're kind of competing for how many hours you're working and how hard you're working. And it's not always the case that effort and time correlates with quality of output. And I think that is a well-described challenge with kind of taking those jobs out of schooling, is that it is definitely straight to 100 miles per hour out of the gate there. And that said, that kind of you get credit for that as well. I mean, there are dog years in terms of learning that you get as a result, but it's certainly not a lifestyle that's for the faint of heart.
Yeah, I was going to ask that because you're at McKinsey and it seems hyper competitive by all the stories, and it seems like maybe a difficult environment and work culture for a lot of people.
I think it is an up or out ecosystem where you get ranked directly every 6 months, and if you're not performing well, you're counseled to leave, and if you're doing well, the progression is very rapid too. I think they do a very effective job of kind of moving people along quickly. And so it's I would say quite different than, say, the academic world, where professors stay professors for an extraordinarily long period of time, and therefore that limits the spots for new professors. In contrast, McKinsey, for example, actually kind of has an early retirement that is kind of encouraged, if not forced, on some of the partnership to make those senior most spots available, and actually kind of leads to rapid opportunity for advancement throughout, which and I think there's no way to ignore that also the compensation does the same as well. That is a very rapid growth while you're there, and I think makes it very difficult for some people to leave, because the opportunities pretty quickly outside can't match that.
How long were you there?
2 years, not even 2 years actually. So I got to know my next boss actually while I was there, and he was a McKinsey alum as well. So we got connected through that network, but he was also one of the individuals who helped put together Myocardia that I had mentioned previously. So Neil was at Third Rock Ventures and helped put together Myocardia. So I was very interested in kind of talking to him and even seeing if there were opportunities where I could go join Myocardia, having built some of that kind of business skill set at McKinsey for a couple of years, and then go join the biotech that was working directly in the space that I knew very well. But Neil had actually just left Myocardia to start a new company, which was called Bridge Biopharma, kind of a similar thesis, thinking about inherited diseases or genetically defined diseases and developing novel therapies for them. And I took I'd say, looking back, a very risky gamble to go join Neil. It was just a handful of people in a 2-room office of a bubble tea shop, and really a pretty limited amount of financing at the time. But I thought it was the right thesis. I mean, these genetically defined diseases. I mean, one of the projects that I'd spent some time on at McKinsey was looking at kind of the return on R&D dollars in the biopharma industry writ large, and seeing that diseases that were, or drugs that were targeting a genetically defined mechanism of a disease, whether that's precision oncology, so single gene mutations that cause specific tumors, or Mendelian disease, kind of inherited single gene mutations that drive rare diseases, the probability of success for drugs in those areas is dramatically higher than it is for broader disease areas. And it can be 2 to 3-fold the probability of success. And as a result of the return on R&D dollars in those spaces has been, or was at the time, much higher than it was for all-comer diseases, where the probability of success is much, much lower. And so I thought it was a very clever idea to focus a company in that area. And there was also some financial engineering aspects of the company in terms of setting it up so that we have separate companies focused on each individual disease area, could bring folks who are really incented to perform and have the expertise for each of those rare diseases. That was a very clever idea that Neil was putting together. And so I joined when it was exceedingly small, and was there for over 5 years, working on building up that company to now I think it's about 500 people, has had a few drugs approved, and knock on wood, it looks like a few more coming. Really got to do far more than I was qualified to do at the time. And that's one of the advantages that you get of joining a company before it has been de-risked, in terms of a company that had a lot of possible ways to fail. And I think in many different situations it might have, but some combination of strategy, effort, and luck that it didn't, and I think is now a lasting, successful biotech company. So it's really a great experience to go do that from the outset.
Yeah, sounds like you made a good bet there. If it had have failed, what were you thinking was the next option?
Actually, that was largely part of my decision making when I took the job. Was what's the worst that could happen? I thought was a fine way to think about it, which is, look, I had a solid PhD. I had just been at McKinsey. I thought, look, I'm going to be able to get another good job. There's plenty of opportunities out there. I expect that I'll find something new. It was also at a time that was, I mean, now in the last couple of years, I think we've gotten used to a different rate environment in terms of what the cost of capital looks like as interest rates have come up. But back in 2015, 2016, 2017, cost of capital was low, and it was low for the next 5 years. So there were many biotechs that were getting sprung up, that were getting large funding rounds, that were getting really lots of opportunities for people to take a swing at something that was going to be potentially very successful. And like I would be lying if I said that I knew that the rate environment was going to stay that way for 5+ years and then not be that way. But it was certainly the right place and right time to start working on an early stage company. And I think had just enough either confidence that there would be something else out there, even if it went terribly, and so was willing to take the bet, such that if you do win, you win in a meaningful way and get to learn a lot while you're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, the economic conditions have changed a lot. And just from your perspective, what you are seeing in the space, how are biotechs approaching things differently perhaps, and investment companies in the biotech space, given these changes with interest rates and maybe some other uncertainty?
Yeah, well, I think there's really no surprise that an increase in the interest rates and the cost of capital overall should slow investment in biotech. It's one of the industries that I expect is most sensitive to the cost of capital, because we invest hundreds of millions of dollars over many years to develop a drug, and then all the revenues from that drug come much later down the line. And so the valuation of biotech companies is incredibly sensitive to the cost of capital. And I think you can see that from many of the banks. They'll show the direct correlation between the biotech index and the Federal Reserve rates, and show that they're inversely correlated, that the higher the rate is, the worse biotechs perform, and vice versa. So I think it's no surprise whatsoever that with a higher rate environment, biotech investment in early stages has suffered. I think some of the themes that became a result of that were that investment seems to trend towards later stage programs as well, for also an obvious reason, which revenues are closer for those programs. And so the amount of years you have to discount from is smaller. Fewer rounds where investors were looking to put a few $100 million against a new Science, Cell, or Nature paper and say, look, let's just see if we can make a drug in the next decade. I think that thesis, and that might have been plausible when cost of capital was much lower. In kind of this new environment, those types of investments make less sense, and you have to hold a much higher bar for those types of moonshot bets in terms of the probability of success and the cost to get there. So I'm hopeful that we're kind of on the turning point here. I think every interest rate print changes the dynamic a little bit, but I think in general it's probably the case that interest rates and inflation has certainly come down to a much more manageable level, and so I think it's probably getting back to a normal, healthy level for biotech as well.
Yeah, I mean, you said it seems to favor the later stage companies where there's less risk. Do you feel like there were changes in the focus areas of that investment in terms of diseases, or was that kind of agnostic?
I don't know the data well enough to comment for sure, but I do think that, for example, I mean, one of the things I love about this industry is that every time you're successful, you can't just go do the same thing again and have it be successful too, because every time something is successful, it changes the bar for the next company. It's the better than the Beatles phenomenon, that if as soon as something works, you have to be better than the best thing that ever was to have success in biotech. And I think what that means is you really can't do the same thing over and over again. And having known the kind of monogenic disease landscape for a number of years, like you can't just go back and make another drug for the diseases that we've already created drugs for and have the same probability of success of being a successful drug. So we now have successful products for sickle cell disease and the inherited cardiomyopathies and cystic fibrosis and transthyretin amyloidosis, and the list goes on and on. The industry has been very successful over the last decade at making drugs in these spaces, such that we're now having to either move down the list in terms of going after diseases that are a bit smaller, or taking some of the learnings that we had from those areas and bringing them to other indications where there is still unmet need as well. And so I think necessarily the field has to keep moving, and that's what's beautiful about it, is we solve a disease or we create a new product for a disease, and it raises the bar for everything else to come in that area. And so I think that's therapeutic area dependent. We've seen a shift away from oncology towards other therapeutic areas, towards inflammation, immunology, obesity, areas that have kind of clearly become the places where investor dollars have shifted in the last couple of years.
Right. And so when you're at Bridge Bio, is that when you also got involved being a partner in a venture capital?
So
firm as
that's when
well?
I
Is that the same
actually,
kind of
that's
time?
when I left Bridge, I went and joined a venture fund and spent a year actually working on an early stage company launch. And we're actually, I'd say, weeks away from actually launching that company. But then the molecule that we were working on had a tox problem that meant that it was not going anywhere. And so I spent about a year working on that program, very close to launching it, actually signed terms for a Series A financing. And then, as happens in this industry, drugs don't work sometimes for a variety of reasons. And so that was, had to move on after kind of not quite a year there.
Yeah. What was that moment like when you really realized this just isn't happening?
Oh, I mean, it's always tough. Every time you run an experiment, there's multiple ways that it can read out. I mean, it's part of the joy when it does work is that there has to be the failure moments that feel the opposite. And so I think I've certainly experienced both. When I was at Bridge, we saw kind of multiple very successful proof of concepts as well as successful pivotal studies, but also still remember very vividly when they didn't, in terms of what it feels like when you get a call from a biostatistician that, hey, this did not work. The p-value was a number that you're not excited about at all in terms of the difference between the treatment and placebo groups. And I mean, it's why this industry is hard. It's that even things where they should work, where the mechanisms look great, the early data is convincing, biology is not predictable, clinical trials are often unpredictable. Who you enroll, how you enroll them, the time course that can be different. And there's all sorts of things that are very difficult to predict and design in these studies. And I think I've certainly experienced both the joys and the struggles of when those trials read out in one direction or the other.
Yeah, it seems like you approach it with a lot of grace there and just take the good with the bad.
It's easy it's easy in retrospect to have grace about it. In the moment, it's not always as graceful, but that's okay. We learn from it.
Cool. So talk to me about Spyre Therapeutics. So how did this come about?
Yeah, so I joined Spyre last year. I was actually the first official employee of Spyre last year, but the drugs that we've been working on were developed a couple years ago. The investor group that put this together had an incubator that was working on these antibodies, and then once they got to a certain stage, decided to put them into a new company, spin them out, and go raise cash for it. And so we actually did that cash raise in a reverse merger and public financing immediately. So this is the first time certainly that I've done the public startup. Is a bit of a different model than kind of being a private startup for a time and then going the IPO route. This one we took public immediately to raise that first capital, which is a different set of challenges, but ultimately a great outcome in that we were able to raise a lot of capital for the company relatively quickly. The focus for the company is on new therapies for inflammatory bowel disease. So that's ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease as the two different forms. And the focus is really the current products available for both UC and Crohn's disease have, I would say, two obvious issues, which is that one, the efficacy is surprisingly poor for as common these diseases are. So for drugs that are available today in UC and Crohn's, the remission rates for patients is on the order of 25% or less for most drugs. So that means most patients have to cycle through multiple therapies to get to and stay in clinical remission. On the other hand, there are also, I'd say, relatively immature product profiles as well, and that we still have multiple drugs that are available for this disease that are either given by intravenous infusion. So patients have to go in every few weeks to an infusion center and actually get the antibodies infused. And then other times we have injectable antibodies as well, but some of them are very frequent. As often as every 2 weeks, patients have to take a shot for these therapies that, again, don't offer excellent efficacy either. And this is very different than some other inflammatory diseases where we're pushing kind of 80% plus remission rates for the advanced therapies. So the idea for Spyre is really kind of to address convenience as well as efficacy with the products. We're really not working on new targets. These are kind of well-validated targets that we're working on. They're things that have already worked, but that we're trying to make better versions of the antibodies that are on the market today. So that includes, say, incorporating half-life extending modifications to the antibodies so that they last somewhere between 2- and 4-fold as long in the body. It means we can take a drug that is dosed as infrequently as every 2 weeks, and we think a reasonable chance at being able to dose it quarterly instead of every 2 weeks. And that's a meaningful improvement in convenience. And then on the efficacy side, there are kind of a couple of different ways that we aim to improve on the efficacy, which is one, in some cases, it looks like there's an opportunity to have kind of greater target coverage, as in to dose more of these drugs and get greater coverage of the target that you're trying to hit, and hopefully be able to drive a higher probability of remission with that approach. And then in the long run, what I expect to be the most interesting angle of the company is actually testing these products in combinations with each other. We actually have interesting proof of concept in this space. J&J ran a study called the Vega study that was very exciting, where they basically combined two of their drugs in ulcerative colitis patients and saw that the remission rate together was basically additive compared to the individual monotherapies, and really suggests that it's possible to safely put two of these immune suppressive agents together and see a much different level of efficacy. So that's really what we're pursuing, is not just kind of more convenient drugs, but testing them together. So hopefully we can have quarterly drugs that we're hitting multiple targets simultaneously, hopefully get that improvement in efficacy, and then also products that are far more convenient than the ones that are on the market today.
Nice. So sort of better targeting, maybe last longer, and ability to use in combination therapy.
That's exactly right. And the idea here is that, again, kind of to our earlier point about what are investors interested in here, like this is early stage. This is not kind of, we're just about to start our phase 1 studies this year for multiple of the molecules, but we're not taking the same amount of risk that you often see with early stage companies, where they're exploring new targets, new biology, even new mechanisms of delivery, new modalities. This really isn't that. These are really precedented targets that we're working on, things that we know work. The half-life extending technologies also have been well demonstrated to work. Even the idea of combinations has been shown in this space to work. It's really putting these things all together into a single product profile and hopefully delivering that as quickly as we can.
And can you run me through, you might have said it, but can you run me through what was that decision to spin it out and then go public immediately?
Yeah, so I mean, there's multiple ways to finance companies. The standard way would have been a Series A, Series B, and then an IPO sometime down the road. But really, the situation here is that one of the targets that we're working on is a target called TL1A. And just right before we took this company public, there was a very large acquisition of a company called Prometheus by Merck for about $11 billion, where they bought a TL1A with phase 2 data. And so our molecule, we think, has some interesting properties that might make it superior to what was available. And we thought that there was a reasonable chance that we could get long-term public investors interested in what we're doing, even though it was an early stage, because there was this very recent precedent in the space that people were excited by. And that turned out to be true. So we did a $210 million financing immediately in June, and then we've actually done 2 since then as well. So we've raised for this idea about $570 million over the last 9 months or so to kind of do these individual molecules and then test them in combinations. And it really saves us the hassle of having kind of multiple private venture rounds before going public. Really no certainty that you'd be able to do that in markets that clearly shift in terms of the macro environment, and really kind of take advantage of the capital availability when it was there.
Got it. I see. So I feel like with your background, with the venture capital space and, starting these, different ventures, it seems like you've probably seen and met a lot of founders, probably seen what is and isn't successful. Are there any common trends, sort of big takeaways that you took away as you sort of begin Spyre? Any do's and don'ts? And
yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges with this industry is, even when you do everything right, you're still dealing with science and biology and clinical studies that are pretty tricky. And I think we give, and look, I give a lot of credit to the things that work, and we don't, when we blame a lot of people when things don't work. And as much as I would love to take all the credit for all the things that have worked that I did, I'm not sure that it's always fair, that sometimes kind of these things happen outside of your control. And the best that you can do is kind of run the right experiment, design it well, execute it well, and then the rest is up to kind of the science and the biology. In terms of kind of building companies in this space, I really do love this early stage of it, because I mean, biotechs at this stage have experts in every different area. You have manufacturing experts, regulatory experts, accounting, legal, clinical experts in all these different areas, and there's almost no redundancy. You almost only have one or two people in every function, and so there's basically there can't really be finger pointing. There's no, it's obvious who made a mistake if there's a mistake, because there's only one person doing each job, and together you're putting together a plan that stitches together financing strategy, clinical strategy, preclinical and toxicology strategies, with no one being able to do each other's jobs. And that is as perfect a team game as I've seen, which is really a lot of fun. And I think that's, in terms of what I think matters the most, is kind of hiring individuals that have the ability to live with that amount of ownership, that mentality that, look, it is all on me in this particular area, and that's okay. And I'm willing to make decisions with 80% of the data that I need to make those decisions, and adjust if they don't, and to be comfortable with it. Because you can certainly get into analysis paralysis, where you just waste your time looking at a decision 100 different ways. But one of the most expensive things you can be in this industry is slow, because you're competing with all sorts of other companies in the spaces that you're working on, and being first to market or being soon behind somebody else is very, very valuable. And so it's something that you really need to, it's a different culture, different mindset of the groups that you need to pull together to be successful in this space.
Wow. Yeah, I've been listening to a podcast called How to Take Over the World, kind of like analyzes different leaders in history, both sort of recent past, like Steve Jobs, and then like Napoleon. And it seems like the common trends among them are like move very quickly.
It's pretty rare that you find that your decision with 95% of the information is that different than your decision with 80% of the information. And sometimes you can make that decision in a fraction of the amount of time and get to the answer before you found out the other one anyways. And I think that's anyways, I love working in this industry for that exact reason. And this stage of biotechs is I think as exciting as it gets. I also think it's why kind of smaller biotechs have generally outperformed in terms of the productivity of R&D dollars, has just been much higher with these types of companies than it was in the much larger organizations. We functionally decentralized the decision about kind of how much money we spend on drug X or drug Y, from it used to just be heads of R&D at large organizations made those decisions. Now it's an entire ecosystem of venture funds and hedge funds and public market investors who are deciding how much money goes towards each program. And I think it becomes a very interesting market game in terms of understanding how we fund these really important drugs and move them forward. And speed is such a critical component of that.
Right. Yeah, but just pulled you up. There you are. That's cool. So you are CEO now. That seems like a courageous step. Were you ready for that? What's been sort of the steepest part of the learning curve?
Oh, I don't think you can be ready for it. I mean, I think it's basically all the glory, but all the blame too. And I think that's fine. It means all of the hard decisions seem to come to the CEO, whereas most of the things that are solvable get solved beforehand, and so that makes it a lot of tricky things along the way. And I think that's always the challenge, is basically deciding, like, how are you going to make a decision about something? Is it, how many experts do you want to talk to before you make a decision about it? Do you really have 80% of the information and enough to make a call, or do you actually only have 40 and you need to do XYZ before you can actually be sure about what you're doing is correct? And at the same time, I think you deal with a lot of people. I mean, you deal with an entire management team that reports into you, as well as an entire board of directors and set of investors that are betting on you as well, and a lot of different stakeholders to manage in terms of kind of, okay, ultimately you're accountable for the decisions that you make, but you have a lot of people that are counting on those decisions. And I think that's like it's a lot of pressure. It's also a huge privilege as well, in terms of kind of having the ability to do that. The thing that I love the most about it is functionally getting to choose the people that I spend my time with. Kind of a group of, again, just extraordinarily talented individuals who know their areas with great detail and can bring them together, but also picking people that are low ego, that are nice and humble and take input from others and contribute in ways to outside their area of expertise, that put their hands up for things that aren't in their job description, and again, like that's the joy of this job, is getting to work with extraordinarily talented individuals who are generally working on this for the same reason. I think what's nice about working in larger disease areas now is that both I and most of the people at the company know people that have ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. We tend to have patients come in to many team events over the course of the year to hear about the disease course and understand what the issues are with the therapies that are available today for them. And it's just like every job has days that are challenging and difficult and problems that are hard to work on. Working on them with people that you enjoy spending your time with, and that you're all kind of united towards a common mission, that's what makes it a lot easier to kind of get up and do it every day.
Yeah, it's so great when you can get that perspective of the human behind the research. Is it weird having gone from cardiovascular medicine and muscle physiology now to immunology
Inflammatory
and
bowel disease? No, I
inflammatory
mean,
disease?
absolutely. Yeah, no, I think the science of it is all a learning curve for me. I actually found that Bridge Bio was a great opportunity for that, because most rare diseases or Mendelian diseases are all over the gamut of therapeutic areas, and yet they came together in a single company to focus on. So got to spend all sorts of time working on disease areas, from nephrology to oncology to all sorts of different areas. And of course, there's incredibly different things about each of these areas, about the regulatory and development paths for each of them, about the teams that are coming together. This is the first monoclonal antibodies that I've worked on versus small molecule gene therapies that we were predominantly working on at Bridge Bio. So it's absolutely a learning curve on both the science and on the science and the company building aspects. And that also is what makes it fun and interesting, and learning things that we already know.
Right. Amazing. So when you're not hard charging as a CEO of biotech, how else are you spending your time? What little of it you have?
I think that's probably the place to start. Is that I mean, one of the sacrifices of either the consulting job or early stage biotechs is the amount of time outside the job is not what you wish it was. I tend to like doing outdoorsy and athletic things for my spare time. So run kind of half marathons, play basketball, trying to get up on the skill sports that I didn't play as a kid, like the golfing and racket sports that I would love to be able to do as I age here, but really have no ability at any of them yet. So it's that is maybe even a steeper learning curve than the immunology space.
Hey, you need to get into the pickleball trend, Cameron.
So yes, living up here in the Pacific Northwest, they claim it's originated up here. So I think that's the place to do it.
Oh, there you go. Cool. Hey, well, maybe we'll just wrap up. I'll ask you my final question I like to throw at people, which is, if you give your one piece of advice or wisdom in the area of work, productivity, health, growth, relationships, really anything, what do you think it would be and why?
Yeah, I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but the advice that I always give, because I find it pretty difficult to look back at my career and say, hey, these are the decisions that I made, and therefore you should make these too because they work for me. Because we only get to see one outcome of the decisions that we make. And of course, they're a factor of the decision at the time in those circumstances that led to the outcome. And I think many of the decisions come with trade-offs. We talked about one just now. It's like, okay, I chose to do a consulting path and kind of early stage biotech building that take huge trade-offs in terms of the amount of time you have for friends, family, hobbies, and everything else as a result, and traveling and just being away from home all the time. So the only advice that I typically give is basically, the first thing you need to do is understand what your objective is. What's actually the function that you're solving for? What is it that gives you a fulfilled and happy life? And focus your time initially understanding what that is, and then planning accordingly in terms of saying, look, here's the things that I think I'm good at, and here's what the world seems to be telling me that I'm good at, and then prioritizing your decisions accordingly to that. And I wouldn't tell somebody, hey, go join a brand new early stage startup because that's what I did and was successful with it, or same thing with consulting. It's those things worked for me, and they worked for me at the time they worked for me. And I was solving for a set of things that everyone may not be solving for as well. So that's where I always start. Like, what do you actually want out of life? What are the things that are important to you? And then make your choices accordingly to that. And that's really, I think, the best I can do in terms of career guidance.
Great. Cameron, really appreciate you sharing your insights today. You have had an inspiring career, and yeah, really pursuing something of great worth to society. So really love that. Where should people go if they want to see, what you're up to, what the company's up to? You're on LinkedIn as well, right?
I'm on LinkedIn. Spyre Therapeutics is, as it sounds, though we have a Y instead of the I, because a Y looks like an antibody. So Spyre Therapeutics is the name of the company, and happy to have people follow along.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.